The breaking news of the night is Donald Trump's longest-serving chief of staff in the White House, John Kelly, is now making public statements in 2 interviews today and tonight opposing Donald Trump's candidacy. Donald Trump was the stupidest major party nominee for president when he first ran for president 8 years ago. Now, at age 78, he is demonstrably even stupider. His proposals about tariffs, for example, have gone from childishly naive 8 years ago to crazily deranged now. Just on economic policy alone, Donald Trump is the stupidest and most dangerous presidential candidate in history. But the breaking news of the night is that Donald Trump's longest-serving White House chief of staff, former Marine Corps General John Kelly, has gone public in 2 interviews to warn the country against the dangers of allowing Donald Trump to win the Electoral College again. The New York Times has released audio of its interview with John Kelly saying, among other things, that Donald Trump is indeed a fascist.
Certainly, the former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian. Admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
74 years after General Dwight D. Eisenhower and the greatest generals in the history of combat defeated Adolf Hitler in World War II and drove him to suicide, General John Kelly still had to battle Adolf Hitler in Donald Trump's White House.
What would you say when he said to you that Hitler did a lot of good things?
Well, I tell him that. I said, first of all, you should never say that. But if you knew what Hitler was all about from the beginning to the end, everything he did was in support of his racist, fascist, life, philosophy, so that nothing he did you could argue was good. It was certainly not done for the right reason. And, but he would occasionally say that.
What would he say when you would lay that out to him?
He'd just, that would be the end of the conversation usually.
Donald Trump is the most ignorant person who has ever held the title of president in this country. And he proved that in many ways, including in his administration, not just because of his admiration for Adolf Hitler, but because of his admiration for Adolf Hitler's generals. In an article by Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, published today before the New York Times interview with John Kelly was published, this article in The Atlantic includes an interview with John Kelly about Donald Trump's admiration for Hitler and Hitler's generals, who every historian knows were actually the worst generals in the European theater of World War II. We will consider just how demented Donald Trump's admiration is for the Nazi generals who lost World War II, after some of them repeatedly participated in plots to assassinate Adolf Hitler, later in this program when Yale history professor Timothy Snyder joins us. Donald Trump, more than once in the White House, said that he wished he had Hitler's generals because he stupidly and ignorantly thought that they were better than the American generals that we have now, and better than the American generals who won World War II. He stupidly thought that Hitler's generals were more loyal to Hitler personally. John Kelly says that Donald Trump had no idea that Hitler's generals tried to repeatedly assassinate him. In the Atlantic article by Jeffrey Goldberg, there is a uniquely Trumpian statement of hatred for Mexicans, spoken by Donald Trump, but this time he was privately speaking about a Mexican-American soldier who was murdered at an Army base in the United States. When the soldier's family visited the White House, Donald Trump said this.
And if I can help you out with the funeral, I'll help you out. I'll help you out financially. I'll help you.
Of course, when the bill arrived at the White House several weeks later, according to Jeffrey Goldberg's reporting, Donald Trump did what he always does when he sees a bill. He complained bitterly. Jeffrey Goldberg reports, according to two people present at the meeting, Trump asked, did they bill us for the funeral? What did it cost? According to attendees and to contemporaneous notes of the meeting taken by a participant, an aide answered, yes, we received a bill. The funeral cost $60,000. Trump became angry. It doesn't cost $60,000 to bury an effing Mexican. He turned to his chief of staff, Mark Meadows, and issued an order. Don't pay it. Later that day, he was still agitated. Can you believe it? He said, according to a witness, effing people trying to rip me off. That news of Donald Trump complaining about the cost, quote, to bury a effing Mexican came on the same day today that Donald Trump met in Florida with a group of Latino supporters. We're going to show you what President Obama had to say on the campaign trail today and what President Biden had to say and what the next possible Democratic President Kamala Harris said in her interview with Hallie Jackson today. But we begin on the campaign trail tonight with number 2. We begin with vice presidential candidate Tim Walz because today, campaigning with President Obama and Senator Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Tim Walz delivered one of the best descriptions of the stakes in this election on the issue of Trump corruption.
Elon's on that stage, jumping around, skipping like a dipshit on these things. You know it. Think about it. Think about that. That guy is literally the richest man in the world, spending millions of dollars to help Donald Trump buy an election. Now look, they're saying the quiet parts out loud now because Donald Trump has already promised that he would put Elon in charge of government regulations that oversee the businesses that Elon runs. That's a hell of a buy. He could spend billions to make more than $10 billion on the back end. So in other words, Donald Trump, in front of the eyes of the American public, is promising corruption. That's what he's promising you. And you know what? I don't believe he keeps many promises, but he'll keep that one. I'll guarantee you he'll keep that one. But here's the good news, Madison. Donald Trump is never going to be president. Elon Musk is never going to run anything.
Promising corruption. That is exactly what Donald Trump is promising. Today in Wisconsin, President Obama said this.
He's standing there and he's swaying to Ave Maria and YMCA. And, you know, the governor from South Dakota, she's standing there with this weird look on her face like she doesn't really know what's going on. She's like, it's like a hostage video. Can you imagine if Tim did that, or Kamala did that, or I did that? Now, our playlist would be better. But you would say to yourself, this is odd behavior. He called himself the father of IVF. No, I have no idea what that means. You don't either. He said January 6th was a day of love. Hey, you're going to hear this from me. Do not boo. Vote. They can't hear you boo. They can hear your vote. That's the way to send a message. So, look, my point is, you'd be worried if Grandpa was acting like this. right? You'd call up your brother, you'd call up your cousins, you say, have you noticed? But this is coming from somebody who wants unchecked power. So Wisconsin, we do not need to see what an older, loonier Donald Trump looks like with no guardrails. America's ready to turn the page. We are ready for a better story, Wisconsin.
In Detroit, Michigan, tonight, one of Detroit's most famous sons, Eminem, introduced President Barack Obama.
In the rhythm for you to know it's a rap. You said you was king, you lied through your teeth. For that, your feelings instead of king. Detroit! What up, though? So look, I wrote down a few things I wanted to say. I love you too. Thank you. I'm here tonight for a couple of important reasons. As most of you know, the city of Detroit and the whole state of Michigan mean a lot to me. And going into this election, the spotlight is on us more than ever, and I think it's important to use your voice. So I'm encouraging everybody to get out and vote, please. I also think that people shouldn't be afraid to express their opinions. And I don't think anyone wants an America where people are worried about retribution or what people will do if you make your opinion known. I think Vice President Harris supports a future for this country where these freedoms and many others will be protected and upheld. And here to tell you much more about that, President Barack Obama.
Hello, Detroit! You fired up? Are you ready to go? Hey, I've got to say, let me just say, let me just say, I gotta say, you know, I have done a lot of rallies, so I don't usually get nervous. But I was feeling some kind of way following Eminem. I mean, I notice my palms are sweaty, knees weak, arms are heavy, vomit on my sweater already, mom's spaghetti. I'm nervous, but on the surface I look calm and ready to drop bombs, but I keep on forgetting. One of the most disturbing things about this election, about Trump's rise in politics, is how so many of us, even good people that we know, seem somehow suddenly to be willing to set aside values that we were taught. I mean, the day after the 2020 election, thousands of mail ballots were being counted right here in this convention center. And because Donald Trump was willing to spread lies about voter fraud in Michigan, Protesters came down, banged on the windows, shouting, "Let us in, stop the count." Poll workers inside being intimidated. Earlier this month, we learned that someone on Trump's campaign told the lawyer to, quote, to find a reason to try to throw out votes, quote, even if it's BS. Hey, do not boo. Later, hold on. Later, the same staffer said, quote, make people riot. All because Donald Trump couldn't accept losing. Right now, we just saw one of the deadliest couple of hurricanes down in North Carolina, Florida. And while Biden and Harris are comforting families and trying to get aid, and FEMA workers trying to go out there, Donald Trump is making stuff up, saying that, oh, they're diverting emergency funds to immigrants, and that they're not giving it to Republican counties. And so suddenly FEMA workers, emergency workers trying to help desperate people, are worried about their own safety, and people aren't applying for aid. When did that become okay? No, look, I know you know the answer, but I want us to think about this. No matter where you stand on the issues, why would you go along with that? If your co-workers acted like that, they wouldn't be your co-workers for very long. If you had a family member who acted like that, you might still love them, but you wouldn't put them in charge of anything. You wouldn't trust them. And yet, when Donald Trump lies or cheats or shows utter disregard for our Constitution, when he calls service members who died in battle losers, when he calls fellow citizens vermin, we make excuses for it. We act like it's okay. Or at least those who say they're supporting him, they say, well, you know, he's just joking, or it's not that serious, or what, you know, as long as we win, that's how politics is played. No, it's not.
Today in New Hampshire, accompanied by Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders, President Biden ridiculed Donald Trump's campaign position on health care policy.
I'm trying to be a very good fellow. I'm not letting my Irish get the best of me. But my predecessor, the distinguished former president, he wants to replace the Affordable Care Act with what he calls, this is what he refers to, a concept of a plan. I've heard that concept of a plan now for almost 8 years. A concept of a plan. What the hell is a concept of a... He has no concept of anything. No plan.
President Biden visited a campaign field office in Concord, New Hampshire today and presented the stakes to campaign workers there, telling them, we must win.
Think about what happens if Donald Trump were to win this election. Think about what it means. He's made it clear what he wants to do. He's not joking about it. He's deadly earnest. He wants to change the way in which the so-called safeguards of the Constitution are honored. He wants to disregard them. You saw what happened when those folks broke through the Capitol, killed police officers, unless he calls them heroes. He wants to release them from prison terms that they've all gotten. He won't even commit that if he loses this election, he'll go peacefully. He will not make that commitment. He talks about there being a bloodbath if he loses. These are words no president has ever used. No president ever used. And by the way, if you don't believe it now, you're going to learn if he wins. It's a serious, serious problem. So, folks, the first point I want to make to you is we must win. We must win not only for ourselves, but for our children, and the children aren't even born yet. It makes a significant difference.
Voters actually prefer Kamala Harris's policy proposals by a large majority, but too many of them don't realize that. Today, in the Washington Post, Catherine Rampell writes, As presidential candidates, Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are neck and neck in the polls. But if the race were solely about their policies, Harris would win handily. That's because voters, whether they know it or not, overwhelmingly prefer the vice president's agenda to the former president's. Trump and Harris are arguably both competitive on immigration, foreign policy, and the economy, but Harris bests Trump on pretty much everything else, including health care and the environment. Surprisingly, Harris even has an edge on crime. This defies voters' perceptions of her brand. When voters are asked which candidate they trust more on crime and guns, they're much more likely to name Trump. Part of Harris's advantage overall is that her policies appeal to voters across the political spectrum. Maybe this strategy sounds obvious, but it hasn't been to Trump, at least for most of the campaign. He largely catered to his base, and it shows. Today, NBC News' Hallie Jackson interviewed Vice President Harris.
For so many voters, we know that a huge issue for them is the economy. Right. It's the cost of living. I've been on the campaign trail. I hear that in the field again and again. You look at some of the numbers on this, and our new NBC News poll shows that more voters think that the Biden administration policies have hurt them rather than helped them. And I wonder, are the last 4 years an obstacle to you in this race?
Here's how I look at it. First of all, let me be very clear. Mine will not be a continuation of the Biden administration. I bring my own experiences, my own ideas to it, and it has informed a number of my areas of focus, most of which are, on, to your point, lowering costs. I am traveling the country. I am very clear. Cost of groceries still too high. The voters know it. I know it. So part of my plan includes what we need to do to bring down the price of groceries, including the work I will do dealing with price gouging, something I dealt with when I was Attorney General, something I will deal with going forward. Cost of housing. You know, I'm speaking with people of every background in every area of the country, of every age. And, you know, the idea of the American dream was something that previous generations could count on, not as much anymore. Bringing down the cost of housing by doing what I have done in my career that perhaps is a different approach, which is really actively working with the private sector, for example, home builders, to create incentives for them to build millions of new homes and housing units so we can bring down the cost, including what I will do to give people a $25,000 down payment assistance if they are a first-time home buyer. So these are examples. The example is what I'm going to do to expand the child tax credit because, listen, young parents in particular, they need help. They have a natural desire to parent their children well, but not always the resources. $6,000 extra dollars during the first year of their child's life can help them buy a crib or a car seat or clothes, the things that are so crucial to that phase of their child's development. So my plans and my policies are really directed at exactly your point, doing what we must do to bring down the cost of living, but also to help people not just get by, but get ahead. And I'm proud to report to you that economists from Nobel laureates to Goldman Sachs have reviewed my economic plan versus Donald Trump's, and in comparison have found that my plans will strengthen Americans' economy. His plans will weaken America's economy.
Then why do you think that's not landing with voters? Because in the numbers, it's the opposite. Former President Trump leads you on this issue.
Well, when I'm out, this is why I'm going out to Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan, excuse me. Just got in late this morning, actually. But going to 3 states yesterday, and I'm going to continue being on the road. I have to earn the vote. And it means sharing with folks my plan, but also offering them what objective analysts have shown to be the contrast between me and Donald Trump. My plans are focused on working people, the middle class, and what we must do to strengthen hardworking people to be able to do what they dream and aspire to be able to do. His plans are about giving tax cuts, massive tax cuts, to billionaires and big corporations. His so-called plan for the economy, economists have estimated, will exacerbate inflation and invite a recession by the middle of next year. So there's a huge difference between he and I.
Up next, you will hear President Obama praising Wisconsin Senator Tammy Baldwin in support of her re-election campaign today in Wisconsin. Senator Baldwin will join us next.
I cannot emphasize this enough. Democrats and Republicans, conservative Republicans, came together with a concrete plan that would have put more enforcement at the border, more judges to process issues, all this stuff. Donald Trump lobbied actively and told Republicans to vote against it because he figured it was better to have an issue that he could run on for his presidential campaign. He was not interested in actually trying to solve problems. We need a president who actually cares about solving problems and making your life better. And that's what Kamala Harris will do. That's what Tim Walz will do. And to help them do it, they're going to need a Senate full of public servants like Tammy Baldwin. Tammy has spent her career fighting for things like good jobs and affordable health care and medication and personal freedom, and she knows how to make a difference. You know, we were just talking about the Affordable Care Act. Well, as some of you know, and some of you have used, one of the provisions in the Affordable Care Act says that young people, when they're just getting started, can stay on their parents' health care plan until they're 26. Now, Tammy Baldwin wrote that part of the bill because she knew how important it was to Wisconsin families. That's the kind of person we need in Washington.
At that same rally, Wisconsin native Brad Whitford, the M&M of Madison, Wisconsin, who won an Emmy for his portrayal of a White House staffer on the NBC series The West Wing, said this.
With your help, we're going to hold this country up. We're going to hold it up to its spectacular, unfulfilled aspirations. And Wisconsin, God, I love you. You're going to lead the way. Because you're going to send Tammy Baldwin so we can keep the Senate. And with Kamala Harris and Tim Walz, we're going to win.
Wisconsin Senator Tammy Baldwin received the endorsement of the Wisconsin Farm Bureau in her re-election campaign. Here is what her very rich Republican opponent, who has spent much of his life living in Malibu, California, said in last week's debate about the most important legislation for the farmers of Wisconsin and every other big farming state.
Well, I'm not an expert on the Farm Bill because I'm not in the U.S. Senate at this point in time, so I can't opine specifically on all aspects of that Farm Bill.
Joining us now is Democratic Senator Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin. She's running for re-election to the United States Senate. Senator Baldwin, I have to tell you, I've seen a lot of Senate campaign debates. I have never seen a worse answer than what I just heard. Wouldn't that apply to every single issue the Senate deals with? He's not an expert in taxation because he doesn't work there yet. Therefore, he has no position on taxation.
Look, Lawrence, Wisconsin is America's dairyland. We even have that on our license plates. Yeah. So when I heard him, I was shocked. But I have to say, I wasn't actually surprised because this guy really seems to be more comfortable on his private California beach than on a family farm or a factory floor in Wisconsin. But look, on a policy level, it matters so much who's in the United States Senate. The Farm Bill provides certainty to our farmers. It supports our farmers. Their risk management tools, nutrition programs. And, Eric Hovde recently released a plan that would cut the U.S. Department of Agriculture by 34%. Meanwhile, I was proud to receive the Wisconsin Farm Bureau endorsement, first Democrat in nearly 20 years. And as proud as I was of receiving that endorsement, I'm even prouder of the work that I did to earn it. Whether it's my Dairy Business Improvement Innovation Act, which allows farms to get small grants to grow their businesses, or securing farmland from overseas investment or ownership. There's a whole bunch that I've been proud to work with our farmers on.
Senator, what was it like today to be there with President Obama, Tim Walz, knowing how important Wisconsin is?
Yeah. Well, I was so proud to hear the shout out I got from the president on the work that I did on writing the Affordable Care Act. Look, I am so proud that millions of young people can stay on their parents' health insurance until they turn 26. My opponent, Eric Hovde, called that provision stupid, and he would try to repeal the entire Affordable Care Act in its entirety. I came to public service because I spent a youth without health care, because I had a pre-existing condition. And the ability to work so hard to tell health insurance companies that they must cover people regardless of pre-existing condition was an honor of a lifetime. But my race is a toss-up right now in the state of Wisconsin. My opponent, a multimillionaire, has spent nearly $30 million of his own wealth. Mitch McConnell's super PAC is spending. We face the risk really in the next 2 weeks of being outspent by nearly $10 million on the airwaves. So if you care about these issues we've discussed tonight, please go to TammyBaldwin.com and help us fight back. Pitch in $5, $10, whatever you can.
Senator Tammy Baldwin, thank you very much for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And coming up, Donald Trump wants generals like Adolf Hitler's generals, the incompetent generals who lost World War II. Yale history professor Timothy Snyder will join us next. Jeffrey Goldberg reports in The Atlantic today more about Donald Trump's admiration for Adolf Hitler and Hitler's generals. Quote, "I need the kind of generals that Hitler had," Trump said in a private conversation in the White House, according to two people who heard him say this. People who were totally loyal to him, that follow orders. What the ultra-ignorant Donald Trump doesn't know is Hitler's generals made terrible mistakes throughout World War II. And some of the generals repeatedly tried to assassinate him. They were not loyal to Adolf Hitler. The most famous of Hitler's generals, Erwin Rommel, was the first German general to go into combat with American forces, and he lost. Then, in the final year of World War II, when Hitler discovered that Rommel was one of the generals plotting to assassinate him, Hitler offered Rommel the opportunity to commit suicide without revealing to the German people that Rommel was involved in the plot to assassinate Hitler. Because Donald Trump is the stupidest and most ignorant person to ever work in the White House in any capacity, he does not know that the greatest generals in the history of war were the American generals who won World War II. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commander of the European forces, who went on to be elected president of the United States for 2 terms. There was never a German general with the wisdom and strategic brilliance of Dwight Eisenhower. General George Patton. Donald Trump probably saw the movie about Patton, for which George C. Scott won the Oscar for portraying General Patton. Gregory Peck portrayed the most famous general in the Pacific theater of World War II, General Douglas MacArthur. The great Carl Malden portrayed General Omar Bradley in that same film about General Patton. Donald Trump didn't have to read a single book to know anything about those generals. Just watch the movies. But nothing can overcome Donald Trump's ignorance. Nothing. And so, as he approaches another presidential election, Donald Trump wants Hitler's generals in the White House with him. Joining our discussion now is Timothy Snyder, professor of history at Yale University. His latest book is the New York Times bestseller, On Freedom. Professor Snyder, the breaking news of the night from Jeffrey Goldberg includes this fantasy Donald Trump has about Hitler's generals. What do you make of it?
Well, the first thing is everyone should go read that article in The Atlantic, word for word, and give it to your Trump voting friends. Look, Lawrence, I think it's maybe less about the performance of generals on the battlefield and more about a certain vision of how politics is supposed to work. At this point, I'm not sure whether Trump knows something about Hitler or whether his intuition just leads him to the same places that Hitler got to. But what Trump has in mind when he says loyal generals is generals who serve personally the president And that is, in fact, what Hitler achieved. In August of 1934, Hitler was able to make the generals, the officers, the entire military sign an oath of personal loyalty to him. And this has really important consequences. It means that there are no longer war crimes. When we hear German soldiers later saying, I was just following orders, talking about the Holocaust, what they mean is they were just doing what their leader told them to do because there were no longer laws. Second, this changes the whole structure of society. If the military no longer follows the law, no longer follows the Constitution, but the personal orders of a single individual, then the whole society is without law. There's no longer law that matters. And the third thing is it turns you into the military dictator that Trump wants to be. This word that we use for Hitler, the Führer, the leader, that word comes into existence in August 1934 when Hitler manages to get this oath sworn to himself. So there's a critical turning point in the history of Nazi Germany that Trump knowingly or unknowingly is aspiring to.
John Kelly is a source for the Atlantic article, also for the New York Times article tonight, former Marine General John Kelly. He says that, yes, Donald Trump is a fascist, and he says that absolutely Donald Trump wants to be a dictator.
I mean, the evidence for that just seems to be overwhelming. I mean, the only thing which people can cite against that is the idea that it can't happen here or somehow an American couldn't do these things. And those are the very ideas that make it happen here. And if you don't think an America can do it, you're inviting an American to do it to you. There are a lot of attitudes of Trump's which are consistent with fascism, the cult of the leader, the contempt for the law, the primacy of spectacle, emotion over reason, a politics of us and them, which begins from naming the enemy. All of this is absolutely evident. And if we look at history, we don't have to say it's exactly like Italy or Germany. The overall resemblances are nevertheless very present.
We have to squeeze in a commercial break here. When we come back, I'd like to ask about how mass deportation fits into Trump's vision of this kind of governing. We'll be right back with Professor Timothy Snyder. Yale history professor Timothy Snyder writes, as a historian of forced population movements and as an American, I don't think we are taking the consequences of the Trump-Vance deportation plan seriously enough. Professor Snyder is still with us. Professor Snyder, what should we be seeing in that plan?
Well, it's interesting. There's a segue from the last conversation because, of course, the first big action the SS took in Hitler's Germany was a forced deportation of undocumented people. I think the main thing we should be seeing here is a determined politics of us and them. Vance and Trump are not interested in solving the border problem at the border. They're interested in having a deportation from the middle of the country outwards, which would turn Americans against people who are living in the United States. On the scale of 12 million people, which is what is being proposed, we're going to have the whole country denouncing. People are going to have to get involved. They'll be drawn in. They'll be denouncing their neighbors. The whole task of law enforcement will have to change. If we're going to deport 12 million people from the interior of the United States, that means all of law enforcement or much of law enforcement at all levels, federal, state, and local, will be turned away from actual policing tasks and towards deportation, which means that enforcing the law is going to be defined as deportation and other kinds of crimes are not going to be investigated. And that's all before we get to the obvious point of just the sheer human suffering which is involved when 12 million people are deported and roughly 20 million American families are broken up.
As we go forward, what do you consider if you were allowed, a minute to present the stakes to voters in these swing states where their votes matter so much more than those of us in 40 states elsewhere, what would you say to those voters?
I would say things can get a lot better, but they can also get a lot worse. And things do get a lot worse when you toss out all the rules. And what Trump and Vance are proposing is a different kind of system in which we toss out all the rules and we're supposed to trust them as human beings. But as human beings, they have lied about pretty much everything that has mattered, and they've used the power of their positions, they've used their platforms to try to turn us against one another. That is a promise, an open, explicit promise of a different kind of politics in which we do nothing but fight one another and government does nothing for us. That's a bad place to go, and it's hard to come back from it.
Another Trump alignment with dictators. The worst dictator on the planet, Kim Jong-un, a cruel mass murderer of his own people. Donald Trump said tonight, he said Kim Jong-un didn't respect Obama. He thought Obama was a real jerk. And I think he's a real jerk. So that's what Donald Trump has to say about the worst, cruelest dictator on the face of the earth.
I mean, the sad thing about Trump is that he wants to be a strong man in the sense of oppressing Americans, making our government fail, and then turning politics into a struggle of some Americans against others. But with respect to the rest of the world, he wants to be a weak man. He wants to be the little guy admiring all of the other dictators. He doesn't have any sense that American power could arise from American righteousness. He has no sense that the rule of law is actually a source of power. He has no sense that decency matters in the world. And so for him, the worst people are the most powerful people. And so what Trump promises is an America which not only does wrong, but which is simultaneously much weaker than it has to be.
Yale professor Timothy Snyder, thank you very much for joining us tonight. We'll be right back. Timothy Snyder gets tonight's last word.